from from to Clarice Bean to Charlie and Lola. It's not the session that will be happening right now. Instead, as the announcement has been already made earlier, it'll be session number 162 in your planners, the Pike. Gabriele D'Antonio, poet, seducer, and preacher of war. That's a session happening here right now. And we've announced it already yesterday, and there's a board, the information board, telling you about that change. Anyhow, that's all done. Welcome to the 4th day of the Jaipur Literature Festival, Jaipur Literature Festival, brought to you by Rajnigandha. I'd like to begin by thanking all the sponsors: Incredible India, Google, British Airways, here, the Mahindra Humanities Center, Ford, book partner Amazon, beverage partner Coca-Cola. We also have public diplomacy, tourism partner Rajasthan Tourism, university partner Amity University, UN Women, the Glenlivet, data partner MTS, media partners the Patrika Group, Hindustan Times, DNA, Dainik Bhaskar, and Radio Mirchi 98.3 FM. We also have Ambit, the Government of Meghalaya, Aga Khan Foundation, Jan Michalski Foundation, IQ, Penguin Random House, YPO, WPO. Venue partner, our very own Diggy Palace. Hospitality partner for inaugural dinner, Rambagh Palace. Hospitality partner, Writers Ball, Le Meridian. Music stage partner, Clark's Amer. Healthcare partner, Fortis. Ticketing partner, Kyazunga. Decor partner, Royal Treasure. And we also have Kingfisher. Hospitality partners, ITC Hotel and the Oberoi Raj Vilas. That being done, a few basic instructions. The first one being, this is British Airways Bethak. So your journey with British Airways will last around 8 hours with a break of about 1.5 hours on the day. During this time, we request you to keep the aisle very, very clean, right? It's a security measure, and because this is not a British Airways aircraft, there won't be any emergency lighting the aisles, or there won't be oxygen masks falling from above. If we have to run, we'll be running through the aisle, so keep the aisle clean. This is a no smoking zone. I request you all, if you are, well, smokers, please find your way into a smoking zone in the venue. You can ask the volunteers, they'll probably guide you, or you can step out of Diggy Palace and smoke. Most importantly, this is somebody's home. Please keep it as clean as possible. Treat it like you would treat your own home or the home of a guest. I'll make the same announcements in Hindi. ये ब्रिटिश एयरवेज की उड़ान बैठक के साथ आपकी 8 घंटे तक चलेगी। बीच में 1.5 घंटे का ब्रेक मिलेगा, पर उसके दौरान कुर्सियों की बीच की रेखा को साफ रखें। ये ब्रिटिश एयरवेज बैठक है, ब्रिटिश एयरवेज का विमान नहीं, तो ऊपर से ऑक्सीजन मास्क नहीं टपकेंगे और किसी भी आपातकालीन स्थिति में कुर्सियों के बीच की रेखा को लाइट अप नहीं किया जाएगा। तो अगर भागेंगे, हम सब भागेंगे। धूम्रपान निषेध है, वर्जित है। यदि आपको धूम्रपान करना है तो हमारे किसी वॉलंटियर से बात कीजिए, वो आपको धूम्रपान क्षेत्र की ओर प्रस्थान करेंगे, या फिर आप बाहर जा सकते हैं और धूम्रपान कर सकते हैं। तीसरी बात, ये किसी का घर है तो उसे किसी घर की तरह ही रहने दें, साफ सुथरा रखें, बस यही दरख्वास्त है। Right, without wasting any more time, I'd like to invite the speakers on stage. The Pike, Gabriele D'Antonio, poet, seducer, and preacher of war. Lucy Hughes Hallet, introduced by Swapan Dasgupta. May we please have you on stage.
Good morning, everybody. I see that we've got a reasonably young audience, which is reassuring. May I ask how many in the audience have ever heard of a writer called G.A. Henty? Oh, at least there's one. Well, I just mentioned this partly because there was a time when Henty occupied a role in sort of juvenile literature comparable to what the Harry Potter series does today. But that was about 100 years ago. an important thing to note is that how a phenomena which exists in the past can somehow get obliterated and forgotten not very long thereafter. This has happened in music, this has happened in books, and this has happened in politics. So I wouldn't be very surprised if a lot of you may not have heard about the central character of this book, which Lucy Hughes Hallet has written, entitled The Pike. It's the life of a fascinating Italian called Gabriele. Now, pardon my Italian, I think the sort of national expertise in Italian has declined a bit since May 2014, but so forgive my pronunciation. So before we even start discussing this book, I would request Lucy, it's really an exhaustive account and a fascinating one. And before we even start discussing the book, I think I would request Lucy to first give us a potted version of who this man was, why is he fascinating, and that's the gist of the book. Okay?
Is this working? Yes. So who is D'Annunzio? As Swapan says, not many people outside of Italy know about him, but in his lifetime he was a tremendous international celebrity. He was the greatest Italian poet since Dante. That's how he described himself. He was always very quick to blow his own trumpet. He was a brilliant self-promoter. And it wasn't just D'Annunzio himself who thought that he was such a great poet. And indeed, he also wrote novels and plays. He was greatly admired by his contemporaries, not only his Italian peers, but people from actually all over the world. Henry James was a great admirer of his, wrote about him repeatedly. And even Ernest Hemingway, who absolutely detested D'Annunzio personally, said that you had to admire him for the beauty of his writing, despite the fact that he was such a jerk. So D'Annunzio was a writer. He also had a terrifically exciting love life. This portrait that I hope, yes, there it is on the screen, was painted by one of his many, many lovers, the American painter Romaine Brooks, whom D'Annunzio met in Paris in the years before the First World War, when they were both living there. Romaine Brooks was a lesbian for most of her life, but such was D'Annunzio's irresistible allure that she made an exception for him. And they had a passionate but rather short affair, at the end of which Romaine Brooks wrote to D'Annunzio saying, "I imagine, dear poet, you're hoping that when you arrive in heaven, you will be met at the gates to heaven by a curious octopus-like creature with no head but the legs of 100 different women." And D'Annunzio was indeed compulsively promiscuous and astonishingly successful with women. And when I say astonishingly, he really was not good looking. This is a very, very flattering portrait. He was a small man. He lost his hair very early in life. Nothing wrong with that, it happens to a lot of men. But D'Annunzio couldn't bear it. He'd had sort of luxuriant curls as a boy, and he was very, very proud of his lovely curly hair. And when it began to leave him, he couldn't just say, "Okay, I'm going bald like everybody else does." He made up a preposterous story about how he'd lost his hair as the result of a wound incurred in a duel. Everything that happened to D'Annunzio, even, receding hair, had to be made into a kind of heroic story. He could never settle for reality. He always had to big himself up, turn himself into some kind of a romantic hero. So he was a poet a lover, but sexually promiscuous poets are fairly commonplace. They're all over the place. But the reason why he seemed to me like an interesting subject for a book was that on top of all the poetry and the women, his life has a political dimension. And in the 1930s, by which time Italy was ruled by the fascist regime under Benito Mussolini, Mussolini authorized the publication of a biography of D'Annunzio, which was entitled The John the Baptist of Fascism. John the Baptist is the Christian saint who appeared in the years just before Jesus Christ began his public life. So to say that D'Annunzio was the John the Baptist was as though to say he was the person who came before the arrival of God on earth. And of course, this way of putting it was very flattering to Mussolini, because it seemed to say that Mussolini was God come down to earth. But D'Annunzio didn't see it that way. As far as he was concerned, Mussolini was just a rather cheap and vulgar imitator of the real great man, and that was him, D'Annunzio. But whichever way round you look at it, there is unquestionably a direct line connecting what D'Annunzio was saying and doing in the years sort of up to and including the First World War, and what Mussolini and his followers were to do during the 1920s and 30s, when Italy was run by their pretty brutal and oppressive totalitarian regime. And at this point, I have to rather quickly put my hand up and say, I know there are a lot of biographers who only want to write about people whose opinions they share and whom they unreservedly admire and respect. And I wouldn't want any of you to get the idea that I'm proposing D'Annunzio as any kind of a role model. But it's always seemed to me that the bad guys are every bit as interesting as the good ones. And unfortunately, they're just as likely to be historically significant. So, as I say, there's the literature, the love, the politics, and there's a fourth aspect of D'Annunzio's career and personality, which again made him seem very attractive to me as a subject, which is that he was terrifically well read, he was a clever man, erudite, knowledgeable, and beyond that sort of he was brilliant. I mean, he was widely read in many languages. It almost sometimes feels as though he knew everything there was to be known in his lifetime, so that in writing about him, I could write about his entire the sort of cultural ambiance in which he lived. And he was also fantastically quick at picking up whatever was sort of new and hot and useful to him in the sort of intellectual atmosphere of his times. And one of the things he latched onto with great speed was the fact that he was living in the first age of the mass media. He was born in 1863, he died in 1938, and when he became an adult in the early 1880s, printing was cheaper and more efficient than it had ever been. Newspapers, journals, magazines of all kinds were springing up all over the place. Most of D'Annunzio's fellow intellectuals, his peers, as it were a bit snobbish about this new popular press. They didn't want to have anything to do with it. And a lot of his friends said to him, what are you doing giving interviews to journalists? I mean, really, how naff is that? But D'Annunzio not only wanted to be written about in the press, he wrote for the press a lot. And very, very early on, he learnt how to manipulate the media. He understood the art of spin long, long, long before that word was coined. And he showed this when he was actually still at school. He published his first volume of poetry when he was 17 years old at boarding school. So, young and innocent, you might think, but oh no, not a bit of it. D'Annunzio was never innocent. He knew exactly how to promote himself. His first book of poetry got very good reviews, really astonishingly good reviews for a book by someone so very, very young. He was ready with his second volume only a few months later. It took me, I think, 8 years to research and write my book on him, but he could write a book in 3 weeks. He was a much faster worker. And so he had his second book ready, and this time he didn't just want to be a respected poet. He wanted to be a celebrity. And, the word celebrity may, it's now rather overused, but certainly the phenomena of the celebrity has been with us for a long time. And D'Annunzio was really one of the first celebrities of the age of the press. And so when his second book was ready for publication, he sent an anonymous telegram to the editor of a magazine in Florence, informing the editor, anonymously, of the tragic death in a riding accident of that brilliant young genius, Gabriele D'Annunzio himself. The editor fell for it, published the story. The story was picked up by other papers all over the Italian peninsula. Day after day, there were more and more pieces. What a terrible loss to Italian literature. What might this brilliant boy have done if only he'd been granted a bit more time? Condolences with his sorrowing family. On and on it went. And D'Annunzio, who, he not only knew how to plant a story, he already seemed to know how to pace it. He waited 6 days, and then he saw that, he was probably going to drop off the news pages the next day. So just to revive the story, he sent a second telegram, this time signed with his own name, to that same editor, reproaching the man for having caused such terrible distress to D'Annunzio himself and his family, and saying that he'd given it very careful consideration, but he decided this time that he wasn't going to sue. So, that was one of the first of his publicity stunts, which continued throughout his life. I mean, on several occasions, he fought a duel with a close friend. Duels were by this time, they were illegal, but that they still happened, and they always caused a bit of a scandal. So D'Annunzio would fight a duel a week or two before his next book was coming out, which would cause a bit of a news story. So there he'd be on the front pages just in time as his book went into the bookshops. He really knew how to play the public relations. So, as I say, he was a publicist, he was a poet, he was a womanizer, and now we need the next picture. Is this going to work? Where do I point it? Am I doing the right thing? Yes, here. No, I've skipped her. I'm being impatient. Here she is. This is Maria de Gallesi, daughter of a duke. The Duke was appalled. I mean, D'Annunzio, a mere middle-class scribbler, ran off with this aristocratic girl. They eloped, and again, D'Annunzio made a kind of, got publicity even out of his elopement. He and Maria got on a train in Rome to go to Florence to have a sort of secret honeymoon. D'Annunzio had informed all his friends in the press, so that when they got off the train in Florence, the photographers were there. So he married Maria. They had 3 children. This is his eldest son, Mario, wearing that lovely frock. And Mario was to grow up to become a brilliant forger of his father's signature. So if any of you think you have a signed first edition of one of D'Annunzio's works, the chances are it's actually Mario's handwriting you've got. But poor Maria was to say later, when I married my husband, I thought I was marrying poetry. I would have done better to have spent 3 coins on buying a book of his verse. He didn't make her happy. He left her pretty soon, and then embarked on a long sequence of love affairs with in many cases, very distinguished women, the most famous of whom was the great actress Eleanora Duse, who I hope will appear on your screens in a minute or two. Here she is, in her gondola. And I was delighted when I found this photograph of Duse in Venice in a gondola, because Duse was every bit as much of a self-publicist as D'Annunzio was. And she tells this great story about how the night before she and D'Annunzio met, neither of them could sleep. They were both in Venice at the time. It was as though they each had a premonition of this sort of momentous meeting that was about to take place. And he was pacing the city's streets all night, not streets, pavements. And she got her private gondolier, there he is, to take her by boat through the little back canals of Venice. And then as dawn broke, she arrived back at the palazzo where she was staying, and there, as it were, waiting for her, just outside the palazzo, was D'Annunzio, and the rest is history. Or anyway, 8 years of history. They stayed together that long, despite the numerous other affairs D'Annunzio had during that time, including, and this must have been the most hurtful for poor Duse, Duse was generally considered to be the greatest actress of her generation, with one possible exception, that exception being Sarah Bernhardt, the great French actress, with whom D'Annunzio also had a quick fling. So, an exciting love life, but always in the background, there was, D'Annunzio was a politician before he even entered his teens. He was born in 1863, which was just 3 years after the great hero of the Italian liberation movement, Garibaldi, took his 1,000 volunteers to Sicily, and those 1,000 kind of untrained, almost unarmed freedom fighters, as it were, managed, when more volunteers began to join them, they managed to defeat the armies of the French king of Naples, of southern Italy, and that began the process, which over the next decade was to lead to the creation of a free and united Italy, the kind of nation state that we now know. And so that was what was going on in the background of D'Annunzio's childhood. That's what the grown-ups would have been talking about. And even as a small child, he, never one to think small, immediately saw that there was a place for him in this terrific nationwide drama that was unfolding in the background of his own life. A new nation, he thought, needs a new literature. It needs a new great poet, and guess who that was going to be? Before he was 11, D'Annunzio had given himself that part. And so his early poetry tends to be sort of neo-pagan fantasies about nymphs and centaurs, or sort of lyrical evocations of Italian landscape. It doesn't look political, but D'Annunzio felt that in writing those poems, he was doing something for Italy. He was giving this new country a culture to match the greatness which he hoped it was about to achieve. So he carried on writing, and then in midlife he started to get involved in politics in a much more direct way. He was invited in his 30s to stand for Parliament. And now this was a slightly surprising move for D'Annunzio. He wasn't a great believer in parliamentary democracy. He described democracy as a rising tide of grey mud, which threatened to drown the old-fashioned aristocratic elitist politics that he approved of. But nonetheless, D'Annunzio had a kind of just say yes policy. He liked to try. He wrote to his publisher saying, "You may think it's a bit odd, this parliamentary adventure I'm engaged in, but I have to show the world I am capable of everything." So he went into Parliament, didn't enjoy it much. He found it very annoying that his vote, the vote of the great Gabriele D'Annunzio, didn't count for any more than anyone else's vote. So, after only 1 year, there was another general election. He didn't stand again. But thenceforward, his writing became more and more overtly political. And his politics were essentially nationalist, and increasingly bloodthirsty. He believed, as a really rather shocking number of people, not just in Italy but across Europe at the time, he believed that there was something corrupting and grubby. D'Annunzio very often uses sort of rhetoric of dirt, that, you know, civilian peacetime life is dirty. It involves compromise, it involves negotiation with people whom you don't really agree with, whereas war is pure and clean and simple, and out on the battlefield there are, you know, bright flashing weapons, there's, you know, bright red blood flowing which somehow cleanses the spirit. You know, this is a sort of ghastly kind of rhetoric which I certainly find repulsive, and I think most rational people do. But, you know, I'm sorry to say that D'Annunzio was very far from being the only person employing it in the 20 years before the First World War. So he was looking forward to the war very much, and finally it came, to his delight. Italy didn't become involved in the First World War until May 1915. The first 8 months, Italy kind of sat on the fence. But then, to D'Annunzio's delight, Italy declared war on Austria, and D'Annunzio, who was by then in his 50s, insisted on being taken on. I mean, he was, you know, really far too old to serve in the armed forces, but he kind of invented a role for himself. He whizzed around the front in his huge sports car. D'Annunzio loved machines. He was really a kind of a futurist, long before Marinetti, the spokesman of the futurist movement, that sort of artistic and literary movement which glorified modern technology and speed and everything that was new and exciting. D'Annunzio had been a futurist long before the word existed. He actually wrote an ode to a torpedo in 1880, so he was very ready for the excitement of the war with all its new technology, and he became an aviator, and he flew very daringly. He never actually learnt to pilot a plane himself, but he would go up throughout the war in the tiny, terrifying, flimsy airplanes. And actually, we've got another picture. Yes, there he is. D'Annunzio is the little one in the middle. He's always the little one in the middle of pictures. He was a very small man, but he liked to sort of put himself forward. But he would go up in these tiny airplanes. Actually, that one in the picture is a comparatively large one. This picture was taken late in the war when the technology had advanced a bit. But in the first years of the war, the planes were, you know, they really looked like packing cases. They were tiny, flimsy, and one after another of the pilots who flew with D'Annunzio were killed, and he himself, I mean, it's astonishing that he survived at all, but he was in a very serious crash, as a consequence of which he went blind in one eye. So that was his war. That was all very exciting. The war came to an end, and D'Annunzio then really didn't quite know what to do with himself. He was living in Venice, in what I think must be perhaps one of the most desirable houses. Actually, no, I changed my mind. Until this week, I thought this was possibly one of the most desirable houses on earth. But it's on the Grand Canal in Venice. You know, I would love to live in it. I would like to have a large palazzo on the Grand Canal in Venice, but it might be a bit difficult to manage. This is a sort of miniature palazzo, and it's got the only waterfront garden in the whole of that, you know, wonderful great canal, that great sequence of palaces. So, you know, lucky old D'Annunzio always fell on his feet. He was always in debt. He made huge sums of money in the course of his life, but he always spent those sums before he earned them. So he was always in debt, but never mind, he had a terrific talent for persuading his richer friends to let him live for free in their lovely houses. And this one belonged to an Austrian prince, and who had to leave Venice in something of a hurry when Italy declared war on Austria. So, you know, D'Annunzio was allowed to move in. And that was a sort of peculiarity of his wartime experience, that he did risk his life day after day after day going up in these planes. But the airfield was just outside Venice on an island just offshore. And so he could be back in this jolly nice house in time for dinner every night. But anyway, there he was. In 1919, the war was over. He didn't quite know what to do with himself. And several months went by during which he sank into a kind of black depression and was casting around for how to use the rest of his life. He didn't want to go back to being what he was now calling a mere poet. Literature wasn't good enough for him anymore. And then in September 1919, he received a visit from a group of people from a city called Fiume. It's now called Rijeka. It's in Croatia, which is a sort of small country, now independent, but back then it had been a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the great 1,000-year-old empire, which had collapsed in the last few weeks of the First World War. The Allied heads of state were in Paris trying to decide what to do with all the territories of the former Habsburg Empire. And it looked as though this city, Fiume, which is small but strategically very important, would probably be given to the brand new nation of Yugoslavia, which was just coming into being. But D'Annunzio and other like-minded Italian nationalists reckoned it ought to be given to Italy, because it had a substantial Italian population and it had been founded by the Venetians many centuries ago. But it was looking more and more as though the arbiters of Fiume's future were going to give it to Yugoslavia. And so D'Annunzio's visitors had come to tell him that there were some officers in the Italian army ready to mutiny. They wanted to march on Fiume, annex it on behalf of Italy. Now, this would be a totally illegal act. In order to get away with it, they reckoned what they needed was a really charismatic, a celebrity as a front man. Would D'Annunzio like the job? Yes, he would. This was just the kind of adventure he was waiting for. But another thing about D'Annunzio was he was always a bit of a ditherer, despite, liking to see himself as this kind of, iron man of action. He was very, very bad at making up his mind. So he asked these visitors to wait 24 hours while he thought it over, and also because that night he had a rather exciting dinner date. Here she is. She's called Ida Rubinstein. She was a Russian millionairess. D'Annunzio had met her again in Paris when she was appearing with Diaghilev's Russian ballet. She couldn't dance, but Diaghilev allowed her to stand around on stage striking poses. And the great thing about that was, because she was fantastically rich, Diaghilev, who was almost as much of a sort of opportunist as D'Annunzio was, realized that if she could stand on stage during the ballet, she would fund the entire production. So quite some fairly cynical argy-bargy going on there. But anyway, she and D'Annunzio became great friends. And she was giving a party in the Daniele Hotel in Venice, to which D'Annunzio wanted to go. So he went to the party. It was a musical evening, music provided by a lovely female pianist, 30 years younger than D'Annunzio. He took her home, spent the night with her, and she remained his lover for the rest of his life. So that was an evening well spent. And the next day, he set off to meet up with these mutineers from the Italian army who are waiting for him to lead them into Fiume. That was Luisa, the pianist. Sorry, Luisa, no time for you. And here is a rather frightening picture of D'Annunzio. He's the one in the front with the poet's laurel wreath, leading they were known as the Arditi. They were, as it were, the elite troops of the Italian army, and a lot of them they deserted the army to follow D'Annunzio into Fiume. And for reasons far too complicated to go into here, it didn't suit any of the great powers at that moment to prevent D'Annunzio arriving in Fiume or to boot him out afterwards. And so for 15 months, he was able to rule that place as his own little city-state. He made himself its dictator. He called himself the Commandant, or Il Duce, a title which Mussolini was to imitate from him. It was a Roman title, which had lapsed for 2,000 years. D'Annunzio revived it. And under D'Annunzio, Fiume became a kind of political laboratory. People from all over the world, some came from India, from Japan, from Ireland, from Egypt, they all descended on Fiume. It was a place where people thought they could try out new ways of living and new ways of political organization. So D'Annunzio invented a new constitution, which was a sort of odd mixture of modern anarchism and he took as one of his models the constitutions of the medieval city-states of Italy. And as I say, people from every point on the political spectrum were interested and came there. The Bolsheviks, who'd only in the last sort of 3 years seized power in Russia, were very interested and sent agents to observe what was going on, who reported back so favorably that Lenin told the assembly in Moscow that D'Annunzio was the only true revolutionary in Europe, and sent him a little pot of caviar as a tribute to his great revolutionary fervor. But meanwhile, Mussolini, the future fascist leader, flew in. Mussolini loved aeroplanes as much as D'Annunzio did, and a lot of what Mussolini saw in Fiume would be replicated by Mussolini and under his fascist regime, which ruled Italy through the 20s and 30s and into the Second World War. So there was a lot of serious politics going on, and it wasn't just the politics we've heard of, the communists and the fascists. There were a lot of other groups operating in Fiume. There were a gang of people called the Free Spirits Tending Towards Perfection, who seem to have been consigned to the dustbin of history just because they failed to come up with a very snappy title. But there were others. There was a sort of early version of gay liberation going on in Fiume. And apart from all this talk, this political experimentation, there was an enormous amount of, as it were, street theatre, processions, music. Next, can I make this work? Yes, every morning, D'Annunzio, again, he's the little one in the middle, would come out onto his balcony and address his followers. And then he would take them out, lead them in procession through the streets, everyone singing, everyone dancing. He taught them to sing a song, Giovinezza. Giovinezza means youth. D'Annunzio at this time was 58 years old, but he still called himself the Prince of Youth. And he would organize these great sort of spectacles. And in November 1920, just when D'Annunzio had already been in Fiume for about over a year, the great conductor Toscanini arrived in Fiume with his orchestra. And D'Annunzio was a great lover of music. So he was delighted to welcome Toscanini and said he was going to put on a great spectacle to celebrate the arrival of these musicians. So he asked Toscanini to come and give an open-air concert on a great open space outside the city. The orchestra would play Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, and 4,000 of D'Annunzio's followers, his legions, as he called them, because he liked to see himself as a successor to the great Roman heroes like Julius Caesar, they would stage a mock battle. And unfortunately, this battle wasn't nearly mock enough. By the end of the day, some 100 people had been seriously injured because some of the legionaries had brought along live grenades. The place was becoming frightening, violent, totally out of control. D'Annunzio, as I've said, was always in debt because he couldn't manage his household accounts. He certainly couldn't manage the economy of a state. So the only way he could provision the city was by piracy. And you'll see that this is a gang of his followers. And I don't know how well it shows up, but there's a little standard in the middle, near the front, which shows the skull and crossbones, which is the pirate's flag. And these guys would go and stow away. They would go to ports up and down the Adriatic Sea. They would stow away on cargo ships. As soon as the ship was safely out to sea, they would spring out of their hiding places, tie up the officers, and force the ordinary seamen to alter course and bring their ships into Fiume. So Fiume had become a kind of a gangster state. Something had to be done, and finally the Italian government, who wanted to reach some kind of an accommodation with the new state of Yugoslavia, decided they had to do something about this sort of anarchic kind of non-state which had grown up. And so on Christmas Eve of 1920, an Italian warship appeared in the harbour at Fiume and fired a single shell at D'Annunzio's headquarters. And after a very brief fight, D'Annunzio agreed to go. So that was the end of his great adventure. He lived on for another 18 years, but I'm going to stop now to give us time to have a bit of a conversation. And all that really remains to be said is that it was less than 2 years later that the fascists, many of whom had been in Fiume with D'Annunzio, still wearing the black shirts which he'd chosen as a uniform for them, still singing Giovinezza, the song he taught them, marched on Rome and seized control of the Italian state.
Well, thank you, Lucy, for that most fascinating account of an equally fascinating person, you know. A man whose collected works spanned, I think, 38 volumes, who was, in his day, considered a national treasure, maybe John the Baptist to the fascist movement, as you quaintly called him. But obviously, here was a man who mattered, who gave the sort of fledgling republic a folklore, a national memory, tried to create one. So his importance is quite significant in terms of the pure intellectual history of Italy. So why is it that people are so squeamish today about referring to him? Both the pluses and the minuses. I know there's the captivating tale of his life as a philanderer. You know, that's fascinating as it is, but why is the larger national memory of D'Annunzio relegated to less than a footnote?
Well, I think there's one very obvious answer, which is after the downfall of the fascist regime, there was a lot of anxiety in Italy about anything associated with it. And although D'Annunzio never called himself a fascist, the fascists certainly wanted to, as it were, borrow D'Annunzio's prestige and to claim him as a predecessor. And so in the 1940s and 50s, certainly D'Annunzio's political career was very much downplayed in Italy, and his work wasn't so much read. It's now very much back in the canon. I mean, if you're studying Italian literature in Italy or around the world, you will certainly read D'Annunzio. I mean, he really is one of their great authors. There's no question about that. And I mean, the political climate in Italy is changing now to an extent, which means that his association with fascism is unfortunately no longer seen by, you know, a large section of the community as being necessarily a black mark. But I think that, I mean, one problem with D'Annunzio is that his work is quite difficult to translate into English. He's much admired still and read in France. I mean, it's much easier to translate Italian into the other Romance languages like French than it is to translate it into English, because we have this very, very awkward language which has very few rhymed word endings. And D'Annunzio's poetry is very intricate. He uses these very complicated line schemes, which mean that it's just very hard. You can convey the meaning, but you lose a lot of the beauty in translation. So that's a part of it. But I think that, I mean, for me, it was very interesting to follow D'Annunzio's intellectual progress from when he was a young man, and certainly, you know, he saw himself as a patriot and a nationalist from early on, But he also saw himself as a romantic. And in following the way his thought developed through his life, I was able to kind of trace a line between romanticism, which on the whole seems to us all like rather a good thing, and to follow that, the trajectory of a lot of romantic ideas about nationalism, about the prioritizing the individual over the community, about putting a high value on beauty, all these ideas which sound kind of innocuous, even positive, I mean, certainly positive to some extent. But then if you follow them through the 19th century, you know, through the thought of people like Nietzsche, Carlyle, writing about supermen, and those ideas towards the end of the 19th century, they gradually begin to turn poisonous, and they provide the kind of intellectual background for the terrible 20th century dictatorships.
Yeah, it's quite a thing because, I mean, D'Annunzio had a sense of the good life, but I think he had more than that. He was fond of the spectacular, when in terms of his personal finances or in terms of the aesthetics which he espoused. But inevitably, in Italy at that time, they always hark back to the grandeur of the Roman Empire, which was the constant reference points which you find. In that sense, I find D'Annunzio not very dissimilar, minus the political activism, from, say, someone like Kipling, whose imagery, in a lot of ways, and I think D'Annunzio, at one point you mentioned, that was took some inspiration from children's stories which Kipling had written. So I'm still a little puzzled as to why we are so inclined to judge figures and personalities in terms of contemporary sensibilities rather than what they represented at that particular moment in time.
Well, I think that one of the things that drew me to D'Annunzio as someone to write about as a subject is that he belongs with our contemporary sensibility. He, as I said, he was one of the first people to understand celebrity culture. He saw it, he made himself a celebrity, he made use of that. I mean, nowadays it's absolutely understood. We all know that every politician has to travel with a hairdresser. But that would have been a new thought to D'Annunzio's contemporaries. I mean, for centuries, government had, on the whole, been administered, certainly across Europe, by a social elite, a ruling class. And D'Annunzio, as I've said, didn't like democracy one bit, but he did understand it in a way that a lot of, you know, right-thinking Democrats didn't. D'Annunzio got immediately that if you're going to depend for power and influence on the popular vote, you have to give the people, you have to give them a spectacle. You have to make a kind of theatre out of your life and yourself. He has, in one of his novels, he has one of his fictional characters say, you must make your life as you would make a work of art. And everything D'Annunzio did, or anyway, everything that he did publicly, was done with an eye to the way it would play in the press. He knew what a soundbite was long before those words became current. He was very careful always to give quotable quotes, to call a photo opportunity whenever the occasion arose. So that kind of understanding of the interface between political power and publicity was something which he really, he knew about long before anyone else around. But it was something that certainly Mussolini, Hitler, all the great 20th century dictators, they grasped it too. And so the overlap between power and spectacle became absolutely sort of endemic in fascist Italy. I mean, some people have complained that really there is nothing to Italian fascism but style. but somehow that style, which focuses on the great man, on the great dictator, is itself a very powerful political statement.
Yes, I know, because the temptation to look upon Italian fascism as a big fancy dress party is irresistible at times. But there's one particular facet of D'Annunzio which I find slightly, it's not unusual, but it's worth, I'd like your comments on it. At one level, he was a demagogue. He knew the appeal, that he got his sustenance from his mass appeal. And in Fiume, he actually even pandered to the mob. Yet in terms of his personal sensibilities, whether in the disavowal of democracy or all that, he was completely elitist. He was aristocratic, he wanted the rule of the few, etc.
Absolutely. One of the instances that, I was talking about how quick he was to pick up on anything modern, anything new that he could make use of. And he got interested in the cinema very early on, long before any other big-name writers were interested. And he wrote the intertitles, the sort of captions, for a huge sort of blockbuster silent movie called Gabriele, which was very much to D'Annunzio's taste. It was a story of sort of human sacrifice in ancient Carthage with a lot of damsels in distress. And D'Annunzio made huge sum of money out of writing. It took him 3 days, I think, to write these captions, and he earned more than he earned for any of his books. But he never went to see the film. And afterwards somebody said, you haven't seen it, surely you'd be interested to see how your writing was used. And he said, no, I don't like cinemas. People smell.
Any questions? I mean, I know we are slightly short of time, so quickly, we'll club a few questions together and you can answer them. Yeah, please.
Just one small question. What exactly did he write about?
Well, he wrote about a great number of things. My favorite of his work, and the work that has survived best, are, I think, his early poetry. He was, as Ezra Pound was to do a generation later, he was looking back to medieval poetry, and this was again with a kind of political agenda. He saw that the literature of the age of Dante and Petrarch was the great age of Italian literature. He wanted to revive it. So he wrote poetry rather in the style of those medieval poets, but with a sort of brilliance and wonderful swing to it, wonderful word music. So and those, as I say, they're mostly either neoclassical or they're love poems, or they are sort of evocations of landscape. Then he wrote a lot of novels, and he was a brilliant plagiarist. He could imitate anyone. So, he read Tolstoy. Oh, I could do that. So he wrote a sort of Tolstoyan novel. Then he read Dostoevsky. Wow, that's even better. I'll write like Dostoevsky. And he did very successfully. Then he read Flaubert, and he started writing Frenchified novels. And it all got rather embarrassing when his novels started to be translated into French, because D'Annunzio had no scruples at all about stealing other people's work. So when these novels would appear in Italy, and everyone admired them, and that was fine, and there was no problem. But then when they were translated into French, his French readers would say, hang on, that comes from a story by de Maupassant. Or he would lift whole passages from other people's work. But so those were, on the whole, realist novels about relationships and so forth. But then when he came to writing plays, as he did as his work became more overtly political, then he wrote these great epic dramas about the great ages of Italy, of the Venetian Empire, the Roman Empire. Basically, these were sort of great nationalist works, glorifying Italy's past and suggesting that Italy could be equally great in the future.
I think is there a last question? Please.
This is primarily an observation where, sorry. Yes, primarily an observation where we've noticed that he tends to be a romantic in the beginning, but how exactly do you reconcile that with the fact that his disdain for other people almost bordered on sociopathy?
sorry, he was a romantic in the beginning, and
But his disdain for other people ended up almost making him a borderline sociopath.
yes, I see what you're saying. Well, that's what I was sort of talking about earlier, that he took romantic ideas and he took them to their logical extreme. And we tend to think that, I mean, certainly, you know, I'm English, and the, you know, the English romantic poets are still hugely admired, rightly so, I think. But things, the ideas which were proposed in the early 19th century by people like Keats and Byron, if you carry them onwards to their rational conclusion, they can sometimes begin to seem less attractive. And certainly the early romantic writers were insisting on the value of the individual. But if you always say what matters is the individual, you begin to lose sight of the community, and you begin to lose sight of the need for cooperation and for, you know, taking account of others. You know, you can become a bit solipsistic. And so, I mean, Donozio was a great admirer of Nietzsche, and it's, I think in you know, the Nietzsche's writings, the German philosopher, that you find that romantic valorization of the individual beginning to turn into something much darker, which is the kind of the contempt for the community. So then you have the idea which Nietzsche proposed, that, you know, one great man is worth a whole nation of mediocre people, and we can just, you know, forget about the people and just concentrate on the great heroes.
I can see Willie wants to say something. He was, incidentally, Willie was pipped to the Duff Cooper Prize by Lucy, and something which he's never... Two prizes, and they never regretted that.
Samuel Johnson and Duff Cooper. Ladies and gentlemen, apologies for chopping and changing the programme around. One of the nice things, though, about having a free literary festival where you can effectively graze on the speakers, and if you don't like them, you can walk out. And if you do like them, you can walk in, is that you can see which speakers are drawing in people by sheer charisma and interestness or interestingness. And thanks to us screwing you around slightly, Lucy, in the timing, we had a slightly empty hall to begin with, and you can see you have absolutely packed the hall out now. Swapan is too modest to say it, but another reason we had to chop this around is that Swapan has a date with Obama tomorrow, which I can understand him not wanting to miss.
I don't like being stood up, but I don't mind being stood up for Obama.
Ladies and gentlemen, please can we have a big round of applause for Swapan Dasgupta and Lucy Hughes.
Thank you, Mr. Dalrymple. I'd request the speakers to accept a small token of our love and appreciation. Right. For our next session, number 113, The Mother I Never Knew. Sudhamurthy in